Hello and welcome to This Is Us. I'm Becca King-Reed, and this week we're in downtown San Jose at St. Joseph's Cathedral. We're going to do a little exploring and hear some great stories about one of California's historic landmarks. We'll also meet KLIV owner and former speechwriter for President Eisenhower, Bob Kee. And we have a love story for you about a World War II pilot who bailed out over enemy territory and was rescued by the French underground. We've got a lot of stories to share, and it all starts now.
This is us.
This is us.
This is us.
Welcome back to St. Joseph's Cathedral. I'm here with the docent, Jim Del Biagio. Jim, thanks for letting us in the church this afternoon.
You're welcome.
Now, you've been here for a long time, but not quite as long as this church. The church is nearly, well, more than 200 years old. Can you give us just the highlights of its history?
Well, the original church was built on the site in 1803, an adobe church. A second adobe church was built about 20 years later because of earthquakes. They would crack and have to be rebuilt. Then around 1869, after the second church was destroyed, a brick and wood church was built. That one burnt down in 1875. And then 2 years later, this church opened. So this church has been here since 1877, although the first church was built in 1803.
And this is a marked improvement over the first three, isn't it?
Definitely.
This is really something to see. This must have been really stunning in its time.
Well, it was unique in the area because, you know, there were no tall buildings. It was the landmark for downtown San Jose.
Now, behind us is a fabulous piece of artwork. Can you tell us how this was made?
Well, you know, it's a shrine to the Blessed Mother, the Mother of Jesus, designed by the architect of this church, Brian Clinch, made out of Italian Carrara marble. Now, the statues, he commissioned an artist out of San Francisco, Gregorio Bianchi, who liked to carve statues out of old wood from sailing vessels. And so there was a ship called the Stella Maris. He carved a statue of the Blessed Mother out of that, and that name is still on the back of that statue.
So he used the mast from the ship?
Right.
Oh my gosh, and they do look like marble. Now, some of these faces are familiar.
Well, what Father Shoghetti, who was the priest who actually did all the artwork here, would use people from the community. And for example, the cherubs around the upper dome were modeled after the Hart sisters. Hart's department store was the main department store in downtown San Jose, and he used those girls as models for those cherubs. And the pictures of St. Joseph in the upper walls, he used the associate pastor from the church at that time as that model.
What a nice honor for him.
Yeah.
Now, in the center of the room, the altar's in the center in this church was just different, and there's a chair at the top. Can you tell us about the chair?
Okay, the chair is actually the bishop's chair. And St. Joseph's is a cathedral, and a cathedral is a church that has the bishop's chair. The word of chair in Latin is cathedra, and hence cathedral is the bishop's main church, and the chair is a symbol of his authority over his diocese, which is the area he's responsible for.
Now, this church is also a minor basilica. Can you tell me the meaning of that, the significance?
Right. A basilica is a title of honor in recognition of the history of the church, in recognition of its artistic value, and also of its service to the community. So you have to prove those three things to Rome, and then the Pope bestows that honor on a basilica, on a church.
Well, we'll be back with more interesting stories from St. Joseph's Cathedral, but first, John Gregg has the story of a local man whose life is focused on communication. He started his career at the American Embassy in Madrid, Spain during World War II, and then moved on to the White House to write speeches for President Eisenhower. Eventually, he made his way to California and became a broadcast entrepreneur. KLIV's Bob Kee.
We brought her here a couple of years ago, and my mercy, we're bringing loans.
With an incandescent smile, tireless energy, and a bow tie that would make Winston Churchill nod in sartorial approval, Bob Kee is on the job.
Hi, George.
Hey, Bob.
Along with being the most dapper 90-year young businessman in the Silicon Valley, Kee is also one of the most honored. Most recently, Kee was selected as San Jose Silicon Valley's Chamber of Commerce very first distinguished business leader.
Busy.
The dashing man with the bow tie has been the president of the Empire Broadcast Corporation since 1967, And at an age when most guys have hung up their spurs, Kieve runs 2 independent San Jose radio stations, All News KLIV AM and Country Music's KRTY FM.
95.3 KRTY, San Jose's Hot Country. It's a little big town there. It's called Pontoon.
Radio has continued to engage the American public. 98%, something like that, of Americans listen to the radio at least once a day. It's incredible. Has not changed.
Bob Kee has always been on the run. He was born in New Jersey in 1922. A track star in high school at the Berkshire School in Massachusetts, he won the 100 and 220-yard dashes along with the broad jump in just one meet. He was also editor of the school newspaper, the Green and Gray, as a member of the class of 1939. Kee fell in love with radio as a freshman at Harvard, and it would have a profound effect on his path in life.
I spent so much time at it and devoted so much of my energy to it and my enthusiasm that by the end of the freshman year, I was practically running that station.
With World War II raging throughout Europe and the Pacific, Kieve graduated from Harvard in 1943. He worked as an information officer for the U.S. government, first in England, and then in the American Embassy in Spain. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of the people, facing down Adolf Hitler.
We had some propaganda objectives, but there was one that was supreme, and that objective was to see to it that the people in Spain, but specifically the people running Spain, which meant Franco on down, understood one very important fact, namely that we were going to win the war.
Not all the fighting was on the battlefield, but also waged on radio and in newspapers.
We wanted very much to make sure that Franco did not allow Adolf Hitler to run his forces over the Pyrenees, down through Spain, to take over Gibraltar, and thus to cut off the lifeline that we had on the Mediterranean. So that was enormously important.
Following the Allies' victory, Kieve eventually returned to radio working in New York. However, in 1952, when Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, Kieve's former boss in Spain, Emmett Hughes, was hired as a speechwriter, and he brought Bob along with him to work in the White House.
I always say I was a writer for Eisenhower. I got involved in speeches, but I got involved in much more trivial things than that. And sometimes that involved some tricky political issues, where they would send me a draft of what they wanted to say, and I would look at it and know darn well that was not going to fly, and I'd have to confer with the State Department and rewrite it.
Kieve was thunderstruck by Eisenhower's intellect, his integrity, and his precision with language.
I can't express the true excitement that I have about that man. He was so totally misunderstood during his presidency by the press. This man was so extraordinary. He was so fast to pick up on things that were new to him. Just a brilliant guy.
On the walls of Bob's office are copies of his speeches that Eisenhower had edited.
I said, "You must be particularly proud," this is talking to the community, "that your community was named after the great emancipator so long before his fame. And I'm sure that all of you, etc., etc." Not with him. He saw a way of cutting it down. And he said, "You must be particularly proud that your community was named after the great emancipator in anticipation rather than in memory of his fame." And he went right to the heart of it.
Kieve returned to radio after serving in the White House and eventually ended up running a radio station in Rochester, New York. In 1967, he moved west and purchased KLIV.
That was wonderful because I think for a large part of my life I had wanted to live in California and did not think it would be possible. And here was an opportunity not only to do that, but to own a radio station. It was great.
There have been a number of highlights in his 45 years at the helm, but one of the most memorable occurred in 1989, immediately following the Loma Prieta earthquake.
I was in the radio station in KLIV, and that was probably the proudest moment for us as a radio station. We were lucky in that 3 or 4 of our reporters were actually in the building at the time, and we started finding out what was happening. We took telephone calls from people all over the Santa Clara County and were able to report through their voices what was happening in different parts of the county. And I think that the result of all this was that we had a calming effect here in the county, because things were not here as they were up in San Francisco. Are you behaving? No. Good.
Along with running his radio stations, Kieve has been an avid supporter of San Jose, a former president of the Rotary Club, director of the San Jose Symphony Foundation, and countless other organizations. Kieve believes in community service.
I think when I look back at my life, I'm pleased with the diversity that I've been able to participate in. The great experience in Spain, the wonderful experience at the White House, the real fun of running that radio station in Rochester, New York, and the fun not only of running the radio stations here, but also participating in a way that was impossible for me in the past, in community activities. So, are you behaving?
No.
I didn't think so.
And along the way, he's managed to keep maverick neckwear in fashion and the independent spirit of the bow tie flourishing.
Welcome back. Jim Del Biagio and I are now in the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, which is actually a chapel within a church, right?
Right. The modern church rules specify that the tabernacle, which contains the consecrated bread that represents the body of Christ, has to be a part in a separate place in a church. And so most churches have created a small chapel. Here we took the original altar from the church. This altar was in the church in 1890. Turned it around to create the small enclosure we call the Blessed Sacrament Chapel.
Well, it is beautiful. Tell us a little bit about how it was created.
It's made out of Italian Carrara marble. It was designed by Brian Clinch, who designed the church. The columns are made out of Mexican onyx. It originally had 2 large kneeling angels and then a large canopy or baldachin over the tabernacle.
All right, and so this is all gold leaf then?
Right, so it's 22-karat gold leaf. And the altar itself weighs over 26 tons.
So I guess turning it around was a snap then.
Oh, it took them half a day to do that.
Well, speaking of other large things you have here, tell us about the organ.
The Odell tracker organ that we have in the church is only one of 4 left in the United States. It was made by the Odell Organ Company of Yonkers, New York, and it was installed in 1886. It has over 40,000 wooden parts to it. Was renovated during the last restoration, and we do play it when we can find someone who knows how to play an organ.
It's beautiful, as are the stained glass windows. Now, these are very significant. Tell us about the glass windows.
Right. Most of these windows were added from 1877 until the 1920s, usually 1 or 2 at a time. The first 2 came from Italy. The remaining 16 came from Munich, Germany. They were made by a process called mouth-blown Bavarian glass. Began in the 11th century, is no longer practiced today. It's called a fade-proof process in that the colors cannot fade. And usually local parishioners would pay for these windows. Someone would go to Europe, commission them, and then they were brought back here. And you'll see under the names of these windows families like the Ozerays, the Sonoles, the McLaughlins, the O'Connors. They would pay for these windows and have them installed in honor of a loved one.
And there's usually some significance in the window that relates right to the person who commissioned it.
Right. For example, the Ozeray brothers. John Ozeray has a picture of St. John the Baptist, and Edward Ozeray has a picture of St. Edward.
We'll be back with more from St. Joseph's Cathedral, but first, John Gregg brings us the story of love and courage in World War II.
This is a story about luck and love and all the good stuff in between. These days, 89-year-old retired pharmacist Archie Maltbie describes himself as a golf bum. With a club in his hands, he appears rather timeless. Yet long ago in another lifetime during World War II, Lieutenant Maltbie was a fighter pilot flying P-47s over the skies of France, fighting to stay alive one day at a time.
Well, it all happened so quickly that until that chute popped and I'm sitting down here and everything is so nice and peaceful until my plane blew up, you think, geez, is there a war on, you know? But a couple of the 109s that I had just attacked made a circle around me and waggled their wings and flew off. So I got closer to the ground, why I started getting some 20mm flak from that. Some few rounds went through my canopy and my chute.
There was a long-standing joke during World War II among young pilots that if you wanted to have your photograph taken to send to your girlfriend, you did it in a P-51 Mustang. They're very elegant. But if you wanted to survive the war, you flew a P-47 Thunderbolt. They were built like school buses. And that's exactly what happened with Archie Maltbie.
On my 19th birthday, I signed up for the Army Air Corps.
Just like millions of other American troops following training, Maltbie left his country not quite sure if he would ever return.
And I remember very clearly sailing down the Hudson, and many of us were on the fantail of the Queen Mary, watching the Statue of Liberty as she got smaller and smaller and smaller. The thought crossed your mind, you know, will I see her again or when?
In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the shores of Normandy, and they began to drive the German army out of France. It was known forevermore as D-Day.
Well, I flew 2 missions that day, the early mission and a later one in the afternoon. The low-level passes that we were making over the beaches, we could see the red in the water. We knew what was going on down there.
Maltbie flew with the 365th Fighter Group known as the Hellhawks and the 388th Squadron. In a squadron alone, they lost 17 pilots in combat.
Yeah, it was tough for us, but you know, we got used to it. And it became SOP, Standard Operating Procedure.
Archie scored 2 aerial victories during the war, but the first one was almost his last.
And I checked for my wingman, and he wasn't there. And as I was checking for him, I saw to my right and down just a little bit lower 2 more. So I just turned into them. And I closed so quickly, as I fired, the guy blew up right in my face and set my aircraft on fire. And so I had to bail out. And I hadn't been out of my aircraft more than maybe 8 or 10 seconds until it blew up. So the decision to get out when I did was the right one.
Archie bailed out over France, and German soldiers began firing at him from the ground.
I landed in this forest, and God and the angels were on my shoulder that day because there was a 50-yard clearing here, and I was able to come down and land in that little clearing and not get hung up in the trees. I'd have been captured for sure if I did.
As soon as he hit the ground, Archie was racing to avoid capture or worse.
I gathered up my chute and hid it in some bushes and covered it with a bunch of leaves. And I took off through the forest. I ran to exhaustion and I went off the path and I found a couple of big rocks up here that I could hide in. And I was careful as I left the path, trying not to break anything down and so forth. And I'd been on the ground, I imagine, about an hour when 4 German troops came along with a dog, coming the opposite way. I had gone up the path this way and they were coming this way. And I thought, uh-oh, that dog will pick up my scent.
The soldiers never spotted Archie, and he slipped away. Inside his small escape kit, he opened a silk map of France with all the roads and railways printed on it. It was made of silk so that it wouldn't make noise when opened. Maltbie had every reason to keep moving. He'd met a beautiful English nurse named Joan on August the 3rd, proposed on August the 10th, and was shot down on August the 18th. Eventually, the downed American pilot stumbled upon a small French farmhouse.
And I approached a young lady that was sitting in the yard peeling a pan of potatoes. And we had phrases, German, French, Dutch, you name it, in our escape kits. So I'm reading off of this to tell her I'm an American pilot, and she spoke a little English. So she said she'd talk to Mama, so she went in the house and talked to Madame Barbet. And she came back and she said that Madame Barbet said they would help me and shelter me, provided I would give them all of my uniform, my 45, my dog tags, my shoes, anything that would identify me as an American.
The young farm girl that had helped to save Archie was named Roulon, and her fiancé, Andre, was with the French underground, and they were able to get Lieutenant Maltbie a new identity.
So he was able to take my passport photos that I had in my escape kit and get me false identification papers. My identity was, my name was now Francois Leguinic, and I was Basque. And a couple of times I was stopped by Germans when I was in Andre's company, and when they asked for papier, I just showed them this thing and grunted Breton, and it worked.
There were a number of close calls, but nothing as chilling as when two retreating German soldiers burst into the farmhouse.
The second morning I was in that little cottage, we were having breakfast, and a German Jeep comes driving up there, and I heard the damn thing rattling in the motor, and I knew it was a German Jeep. These two guys stopped that thing right outside the door. One of them got out and held his Luger on us. The other one walked in, and he took a half a loaf of bread off of the sideboard over here, and the butter and a salt shaker off the table where we were eating. And he muttered something and turned around and walked out.
The American pilot with the false papers managed to keep his cool.
I'm thinking I'm going to just keep eating like this happens every day, you know. And I did. And when they left, Madame Barbet and Roland were laughing like hell. And they said, you know, it's good. It shows that the Boche, as they called the Germans, the Boche, are in terrible shape logistically because they have never done this before.
After hiding from the enemy for 10 days, Archie headed west, hoping to link up with the Americans.
They provided me with a bicycle. I left Lalone, this little village I was in, and I would say within 45 minutes to an hour, the Germans were in general retreat.
The German soldiers were trying to get back across the Seine. They didn't pay much attention to one more Frenchman on a bicycle. Archie was picked up by a French-Canadian outfit that turned him over to the British. The British wanted to send him back to England, but he just wanted to get back to his unit. So he escaped from the Brits and managed to finally link up with some Americans.
And we told them our story, and they laughed like hell. They said, you escaped from the British? I said, yeah, we did. They said, we need to get to Balleroy. They said, get in. So that's the way I got back.
Archie and Joan were married in December 1944 in a church that had 3 standing walls. In 1977, Archie and his wife returned to the small French village where he'd hid from the Germans and reunited with Roulon and her husband, Andre.
They're all out in the front yard with little American flags going around in a circle to welcome us in the driveway. We had a great visit with them, and I asked Andre what Roland had never had that maybe she would like. They were quite poor people, and he said, well, she has the new house now, but she's never had a dishwasher. So I went into town the next day and made arrangements with the local hardware store to install a dishwasher for her.
Archie and Joan would remain married for 67 years and would have 2 sons, 4 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. Not too bad for a pilot that had been blessed with luck, love, and all the good stuff in between.
Welcome back to St. Joseph's Cathedral. We're just about out of time, but Jim has one more great story for us. Tell us about the statue of St. Patrick.
Yeah, the statue of St. Patrick is one of the few things that survived the fire of the third church. When the church was caught on fire, a couple blocks away, there was an Smith, Patrick McGuire, saw the church on fire, got some of his buddies, the Order of Hibernians, the Irish, rushed to the church here and tried to save things. And the first thing Patrick saved was the statue of St. Patrick, put it on his shoulder and carried it out.
What else is left from that fire? Anything?
Well, there's the bell in the tower and the pulpit that the priest would talk from.
Now, speaking of fires, you have another piece of art here that has an experience with fire. Tell us about that.
Right, the Stations of the Cross, the Way of the Cross, the paintings, there's 14 of them that you usually see inside churches. The O'Connor family, on one of their trips to Europe, were in the city of Reims in northern France, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Mrs. O'Connor was impressed with the Stations of the Cross in that church. They were done by a French artist, Le Mercier. She got a local artist to paint copies of the originals, and this was in 1900. A decade later, during World War I, that cathedral was bombed and destroyed, and so these works of art are considered the only copies of the originals in the world.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jim, for sharing all your stories of the cathedral. We're so happy to have been able to visit you.
Thank you.
For all of us at This Is Us from St. Joseph's Cathedral, good night.